Very warm good day to our friends from Australia. So on behalf of the entire UCLA community, I want to thank everyone for being here. It's not easy to get here. It's certainly not easy to get here from Australia, but it can be just as challenging to get here from downtown LA. So every trip to Westwood is a trip, so we appreciate everyone being here. So let me first express my appreciation to the Australian government for hosting dialogue with UCLA. Specifically, many thanks to the Australian Consul General here in Los Angeles for helping organize this conference. They make a huge difference, and great consulates, as we all know, really have impact on relationships between countries. I want to thank a number of distinguished participants for being here. You're all distinguished, but there's a few people I'd like to single out. You know, our keynote speaker, who will be here, I think, at lunchtime, the Honorable Malcolm Turnbull, who's Australia's Minister for Communications. The Honorable Kim Beazley, Australia's ambassador to the United States, who I've had the chance of meeting now about 3 times. Once in your embassy, I remember, where I saw that beautiful Australian Aboriginal art that I think was on the wall, and it's good seeing you again. Also, the Honorable Jeff Bleich, who was our former U.S. ambassador to Australia. Thank you for being here again. And of course, Karen Lanyon, who was already mentioned, Consul General of Australia in Los Angeles, and you'll follow me to the podium. But thank you for all that you do. So many thanks to everyone who participates, including the panelists and the speakers, and I know that you'll be contributing much of your expertise to make certain that this is a valuable meeting for everyone. So it's trite, obviously, at point to say we live in a global age. I mean, we all know that. We live right here in Los Angeles. It's all around us, the fact that we're international. And we recognize all of our economies are tied together and increasingly dependent upon one another. And countries and entities mix together in ways, new and creative ways, that would have been hard to think about just a few years ago. So many of our challenges and opportunities are global in nature, including climate change and sustainability, which we're all facing challenges there, economic development and trade issues, where again we're highly interdependent, immigration and education, science and medicine. And therefore, it's critical, all these areas where this common impact, it's critical for all of us to forge lasting, mutually beneficial, cross-border relationships to facilitate greater cooperation in the search of global solutions. There are actually very few issues, if you think about them, that stay within the borders of a country. Almost every issue now is really international, global in its impact. So international conferences like this dialogue play an extremely important role in searching for solutions. They bring together first the most knowledgeable experts on critical issues, and they explore our common interests for our collective well-being. So there is just no substitute for diversity of viewpoints, and global diversity of viewpoints makes a huge difference in dealing with these large issues. I'm delighted that UCLA is co-hosting today's deliberations. It's one of the world's leading public research universities. And I say public because I know that the university is in Australia. There are publics and privates as well. But publics play in the US a very special role, and especially in dealing with large societal issues and community issues that we're responsible for dealing with. So UCLA as a public has always been dedicated to finding fair and workable solutions to issues of public concern. And we're committed to bringing our intellectual and other resources to bear in this noble and necessary pursuit of solutions. I'm extremely proud to say that UCLA has considerable international expertise that extends across campus. In fact, it's unbelievable how much expertise there is, and for me, it's difficult sometimes to even discover all of it because it's everywhere. The big examples include the UCLA-based sponsors for today's conference, the International Institute, the Burkle Center for International Relations, the Luskin School for Public Affairs, the International and Comparative Law Program, and the Anderson School Center for Global Management. So these are large, really visible programs, but there are an extraordinary number of programs throughout campus that are dealing with issues such as the ones being discussed today. In addition to these renowned centers of international expertise, UCLA is also blessed with its geography. We're fortunate to have been founded nearly 100 years ago, 1919 to be exact, in a dynamic and global city. That's Los Angeles. It's positioned at the crossroads of the Pacific Rim, Latin America, and North America. This is really, I think, the most, in many ways, most international city in America. And there can be arguments about that, but I really think that when you look at the composition of this city and its location, it really is, in some ways, the future for America. This is where things are happening most quickly. As such, we're eager to play a leading role, along with a number of other excellent institutions of higher education in this region, in helping shape a prosperous, peaceful, and opportunity-rich future for the Asia-Pacific region. So with that, I welcome all of you again. I'm sorry I'm running today. I'd like to stay for the entire conference, but unfortunately I have activities today I'm going to have to be at, so I will trust that this will be an excellent conference. And now I'd like to turn the podium over to Karen Lanyon, the Consul General of Australia in Los Angeles. Thank you.
We're going to jump right into our panel. So today, over the course of the day, we are going to cover a bunch of, I think, very important and interesting strategic issues, security issues, economic issues at kind of greater length and detail. This opening panel is really meant to set the stage with some really excellent panelists I'll introduce in a moment, and to provide a little bit of context and background about the US-Australia relationship, particularly as it reflects our shared interests in the Asia-Pacific. So I'll just note on a personal note, I was in the Pentagon last summer for a tour, and I was struck by the fact that there's an entire corridor in the Pentagon devoted to Australia and the relationship with Australia through various military conflicts. And anyone who knows the US military knows that the Australian military has always been or at least for the 20th century, has been a tremendous partner to the US. So there's a real tie from a security point of view, but of course a cultural tie, very strong economic ties, shared language, culture, free market democracies. We have a lot of things in common. When it comes to the Asia-Pacific, of course, Australia is in the Pacific in a very real sense. The US is as well, as Karen points out, and at least since the late 19th century when we acquired Hawaii and the Philippines, after World War II when we established forward bases in many of our Asian allies, we have had a very powerful presence in the Pacific. And so we both share an enormous interest in what happens in Asia and in the greater area of the Pacific. And of course, we know that the 20th century Asia that many of us grew up with is very different than the 21st century Asia that we face today. And that'll be a big part of our discussion. So with that in mind, I'm going to just mention who's on the panel. There are long bios on your table, so we don't have to spend too much time on that. To my left, as noted, Ambassador Kim Beazley, the current ambassador of Australia to the United States. It's a great honor to have him back. To his left, Jeffrey Bleich, former American ambassador to Australia. We're again very happy to have him back. And to his left, Terry McCarthy, friend and colleague, president of the LA World Affairs Council, and a very distinguished journalist and analyst. So we're going to have a conversation here, then I'm going to open it up to all of you, have some questions. We may steal a few minutes. We're running a tiny bit behind, but we may steal a little time later on. We'll see how it goes. So let me start off with a question really maybe for the two ambassadors first, and then I might ask Terry to weigh in as well. But I know that a leading Australian minister not too long ago said that Australia's top foreign policy objective is to avoid a hard choice between the American security relationship and the Chinese economic relationship. Now, for Australians, this is known maybe as the Hugh White thesis. Hugh White is someone who's really hammered this point. This is a point that comes up at every discussion like this. So what I want to do is just open with that and ask both of the ambassadors just to weigh in on that. And the reason I think it's important is not only for Australia, but of course, this is a question for many other nations in the region. How to balance the important relationship with the United States with the fact that China's large, growing very fast, and will always be in Asia. And the United States, of course, intends to always be in Asia, but we don't live in Asia in the same way. So let me ask Ambassador Beazley if you might weigh in on that.
Okay. Thanks, Cal. You're absolutely right. That is a question that Australians are endlessly asking themselves, or at least the media in Australia is inevitably going to put it up to any American official who turns up in Australia. They don't put it to the Chinese, I notice. This is not a discussion that they routinely have with any Chinese official visiting Australia, because I think they're somewhat overawed. I mean, one of the big distinctions between Australians and Americans is that Australians often think that empathy equals obsequiousness. Americans never think that. And therefore, you know, when one approaches the region around us, I think an awful lot of Australians often take the view that they're not showing empathy unless they're totally sympathetic with whatever proposition, however valid, is being put forward by whoever their interlocutor is. from the Asia-Pacific region. Having said that, we nevertheless do relations with the region reasonably well. The US is not really quite in on this question because the United States is not there trying to create an adversarial relationship with China. The United States is trying to manage their most interesting relationship. And the future of the global economy, the success of the Asia-Pacific region is not entirely, but is to a considerable degree dependent on the skill with which the Americans and the Chinese manage their mutual relationship. So we're not sitting there making choices between adversaries, though that is the implication often of the question. We're sitting there empathising with and involving ourselves with two powers that are absolutely critical to each other and critical to the region. The US is important in the region for a multiplicity of reasons, but not least because it is a powerful investor, a powerful economic player, as well as a powerful military player. And one of the things, though, that the US does do is to ensure that there is at least a viable dialogue about the character of international relationships in the region, the legal basis underpinning it, what are the accepted norms of international behaviour. And our role, I think, as Australians, ought simply to be to encourage that dialogue. And having encouraged that dialogue, also remember our basic commitments. Australian security, long term, rises or falls on the character of its relationship with the United States. Given that it does not have to choose, we can sensibly pursue that relationship from within the internals of its own merits. We don't need to worry about what anyone else thinks about.
Thank you. Professor Beisch.
As usual, I agree with everything that Kim says, and but let me elaborate on a couple things because I think Kim's exactly right. It's a false choice, and it may be helpful to understand where the Australian preoccupation, at least among some media commentators and some of the elites, comes from, and then secondly, talk about from the U.S. perspective why it's such a false choice. I think you were being generous when you said that this is a point that Hugh White has hammered. I think it's, you know, the beating a dead horse doesn't even describe it. You know, the horse was buried and he's still beating the gravesite. But at the time that the thesis was first presented, we were in a very different circumstance. The U.S. had just had, we were mired in 2 wars in the Middle East. We had a very bleak economic outlook after the global financial crisis. And there was a moment in time when it wasn't unreasonable for people to worry that the U.S. was going to lose heart in committing to the Asia-Pacific and might retrench, retreat, refocus on rebuilding the United States economy. And so at that point, the question was, how would the U.S. do that? Would we withdraw from the region, thereby creating the opportunity for China's influence to be extended in a way that would potentially disrupt the security arrangements in that region? Or would the U.S. kind of, you know, flail wildly in the region, trying to assert power without really having any, and try to contain China in some unreasonable manner? That was kind of the fear. And Hugh White's piece tapped into that fear, saying, you know, look, if the U.S. does one or the other, then this could be very bad for Australia, because our economic future depends to some extent on the continued rise of Asia, but our security arrangements have always depended on the United States, and what would we do? And so he wrote a book where he said the U.S. is contemplating one of 2 ridiculous choices, and here's the middle ground that they should consider. The truth is, it had always been the middle ground that we had always considered. We had never thought about withdrawing from Asia. We've invested for the past 7 decades in the security of Asia. You know, we have much of the success, the prosperity, the peace, the stability has been based upon decades of U.S. investment in this region. And now that it's finally coming to its full potential, we'd have to be crazy to try and withdraw from this region. So of course, the U.S. is fully committed to Asia. We never left it. We've rebalanced, we've refocused on it, but we never left it and never even contemplated leaving it. Likewise, no one thinks that you can contain the ambitions of a country of 1.3 billion with the tremendous creativity, capacity, and determination of China. And so there was never a vision that we would somehow stop China from growing and reaching its true economic weight in the world. In fact, it had been at the wrong economic weight and military weight for the last 100 years based upon Maoist excess and imperialist raiding and a variety of other things that had kept it below its weight. Now, we expected it to come back, and we wanted it to be an effective partner. Our whole goal was to shape and use our influence in the region to ensure that its rise was successful, but that it was also consistent with the orders that had been established in the region during that time. And so that's been our goal. So it was a false choice when it was articulated. It's even more false now. You know, 4 years later, you look at where the U.S. is economically in terms of our position in the region. You see where the other countries are in terms of their rise. And I don't think there's any chance that Australia would be put to a choice between its economic future and its security with the U.S. And I'll just finish with this one point. Just think about our economic relations between the U.S., Australia, and China. The U.S. is dependent upon China becoming a strong consumer-based economy. We want to export more because we have been too internally driven with our own consumer economy. So we need a big market in Asia, and we want to see China rise. In order for China to rise, they know that they need to move from an internal consumer market to one in which they are, from an export market and investment market to one which is internally consumer driven. You know, we actually perfectly complement each other in terms of our long-term economic interests. And for that to be successful, we need to have stability in the region. We need to have our partners working closely with both of us. So we want to see Australia selling its iron ore and its coking coal and its natural gas and everything else to China. We want them to have strong relations together. We want Australia to continue to grow in weight as our partner, and economically, that's good for everyone. Militarily, you know, the security arrangement between the U.S. and Australia, I mean, you don't have to worry about that alliance weakening in any way. I mean, we are aligned not only in terms of our economic interests, but we are fully integrated and interoperable in terms of our security forces, but most important, our values are the same. And that's what really drives an alliance. And so in that sense, I don't think that China ever imagined that it would interfere with the alliance arrangements between the U.S. and Australia, and I don't see any likelihood at all that it would. So I went on for a while, but it was a big, meaty question.
Thank you. Terry, do you have a different take on this at all? Do you want to, I don't want to say contradict, but maybe add something different? You don't have to.
You're setting me up, Cal. I'll be a little bit more skeptical here. I think that there is a very finely balanced, dynamic relationship between China on the one hand and United States, Australia, and its allies in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that because the relationship in the Cold War between the United States and Russia was a zero-sum game. If they took Afghanistan, we wanted to take it back. There was no way we could cooperate. Our relationship with China is not a zero-sum game. We're hugely invested in China as they are in us. And so there are definitely benefits that we can draw from this relationship. But at the same time, China is a catastrophically inept diplomatic power, has been alienating all its Asian neighbors with its behavior in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And I think that the presence of the United States must and will function as a sort of a correction unit. So when China goes too far, the US is there and says, you need to stop. And it's very interesting to me that when Obama was in India recently, they we're starting to resurrect this notion of the Quadrilateral security dialogue. And it's interesting, it's called a dialogue. And this is something that was launched in 2007 by the Japanese Prime Minister Abe in his first term. And it was a notion that Australia, Japan, India, and the United States should have some security dialogue effectively to handle the rise of China. And so as we've seen, the politics have come and gone. India has always been the quiet man in Asia, didn't really step forward. Abe got voted out, and then the next Japanese Prime Minister wasn't that interested. The next, John Howard was Prime Minister in Australia at the time. The next Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, backed away from it. But now we're back in this sort of perfect alignment where you've got Abe back in power in Tokyo, trying to show that he will be strong against China to sort of burnish his own credentials. You have Modi in India, who is trying to indicate that India is now ready to come out in the world and play a much larger role in the world. You have a Liberal Prime Minister back in power in Australia, Tony Abbott. And you've got a President of the United States who is looking to somehow burnish his own foreign policy credentials as he faces the last 2 years of his presidency with little help from Congress. And so I think what we will see developing is a sort of a mechanism, and the pivot is sort of part of it, where the United States, with its allies, will not be containing or confronting China so much, but more indicating to China that there are certain rules, international rules, that you need to play by. You know, the rule of law has been this dog in China. They don't understand it. Domestically, there's nothing much we can do. You know, when a party official confiscates a whole bunch of houses because he wants to put up his hotel and people get mad, nothing much the United States can do there, even though it's clearly unjust. But internationally, we need China to play by rules of law. The Indian Ocean takes 70% of the world's oil, about 50% of the world's container traffic. If the Chinese start putting exclusive flight zones and blocking ships, you know, that's not good for China, frankly, nor is it good for anyone else. But the problem with China is it doesn't have this notion of the rule of law embedded in its DNA. And I think it's incumbent on the United States and its allies, and maybe this QSD, this Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, is a way to help the Chinese understand that you can go this far but no further. Because we're dealing with an extremely busy, congested neighborhood with an awful lot of economic growth, but similarly disrupt that economic growth and the price is extremely high. So I would agree that I don't see a containment policy, but I do see the necessity for the US to almost like be a tutor to China. You're growing up, you're getting big, you're going to be a big power, but you don't quite know how to do it. And here are some of the rules you need to learn, otherwise it's going to be painful for you.
Thank you. So you mentioned India, and I want to come back to that. We're going to talk a lot about China today. I think China's going to come up repeatedly. But let's take a moment on India. As you mentioned, Obama was just there. The relationship between the US and India is evolving. India is a giant country, of course, growing rapidly. Australia shares an ocean with India. So how does the change in India, and I don't just mean Prime Minister Modi, but the evolution of India towards more strength, more economic strength, more political and diplomatic strength, which it's really always wielded in a very maybe unusual way. How is the evolution of India changing the larger strategic calculus in Asia for both countries? So.
Well, not much yet. What you've got in Asia, the Asia-Pacific region, and I agree with a lot of what Terry had to say, was a weak state system, but not weak states. There is not the international order as it applies in the zone is developing and is in a very nascent stage. But the powers that are party to it, it's not just China. India's a major case in point, but not just India. I mean, Vietnam in population terms is bigger than any European country. Biggest Muslim state in the world, Indonesia, is there. When I was Defence Minister in 1987, I did a white paper. I was responsible. I didn't do it. I was responsible for a white paper. And our GDP then was greater than the Association of Southeast Asian Nations combined. Well, this is what, 20 years on, a bit over 20 years on. And this year alone, Indonesia passed Australia's GDP. There's massively rapid growth. These are not weak states. They're strong states, but they don't have a system. They don't have commonly accepted rules about how they play in the space between them. China has a view. it's largely a revisionist view. It does not think that the international system is necessarily a thing that is either of its creation or is compatible with how they see the centrality of their show. And part of the job of and the relationship with India is critical in this regard. Part of the job of us all is to introduce to the countries of the region the idea that they're prospering in large measure because of the system that was created post-World War II. And though they've had 400 years' experience of European mercantilism, which has educated them in the, if you like, in strategies that are violent and exclusive, that in fact the success of the world is not the European mercantilism of the colonial era. The success of the world has been based on the post-World War II era. Though, deep in their mindset, not just for the Chinese, but for the Indians, Vietnamese and others, is their experience of the last 400 years as opposed to the last 50 or 70. And so in the fact that there are obvious balances and that we can have a conversation with powers that are obvious balances is, I think, of assistance in developing that state system that we want. There's no bigger player in that regard than India.
Thank you. Others, Jeff?
Yeah, I think the Kim is exactly right, that part of the issue is India and part of the issue is having like-minded states working together. And so part of the rebalance has been to create an architecture that didn't really exist just a few years ago. You had kind of an alphabet soup. You had ASEAN, the ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN +3, you had APEC, you had a number of different institutions, but you didn't have anything in which all of the major powers of that region, China, the US, Russia, Japan, India, Australia, Indonesia, were all in the same organization. And there was a big push for the U.S. to sign the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in order to join ASEAN and use that as the basis to join the East Asia Summit. Now we have the East Asia Summit at the principals level with the president attending, and that is forcing a dialogue among these major parties to sit down and hash out all manner of issues. One of the problems with the alphabet soup was, APEC was only economic, and the ASEAN Regional Forum was only military and strategic. This brings it all together. I think that's a very healthy sign in terms of making India a little bit less quiet. It really, because it's non-aligned, it just hasn't had the weight that it should in these discussions and in the formation of a working order for the region. So I think that's a critical part of it. I think there have also been specific efforts by both the U.S. and Australia to improve our relationship with India and strengthen its weight again in this region. For the U.S., you've seen it most recently with the president's visit. With Australia, they had a couple of nettlesome issues in the relationship, including the failure to sell uranium to India, which India took very negatively. That was eliminated. I think there had been some incidents involving racist behavior towards Indians by some students, and I think there had been a real movement by Australia to express its regret for that and to demonstrate real concern about the importance of strong relations with India. There have been a number of efforts over the last few years, and you've seen a real warming of the relationship, including the fact that for the first time ever, you had a defense minister from India come to Australia for a series of strategic meetings. The last thing that I'd like to emphasize is the Indian Ocean Regional Arc, the IOR Arc, which is, I think, the first time that the U.S., Australia have really focused on the Indian Ocean as this critical economic trade zone with India. And I think that will also bear some fruit. So based on all that, I see India's, trending in the right direction.
Thank you. Terry?
Yeah, India is coming, and we've been waiting for this for a long time. They're coming from a much smaller base. India's economy is about 2 trillion. China's 10. They have the one lingering border dispute that China has is with India. In fact, they want the entire province of Arunachal Pradesh up in the northeast. That hasn't been solved. That's interesting. I don't think it's a coincidence. The Chinese, they have the ability to solve their problems if they want. They haven't. And India's not going to give that up. India's defense spending as a percentage of GDP is actually higher than China's. I think it's about 2.5%. But because China's overall GDP is bigger, China's at 2% of GDP, so its overall spending of 190 billion, whereas India's 45 billion. But India's coming. They have 2 aircraft carriers. One they got from the Brits, the other from the Russians. And they're building a third, one of their own, which will be ready in about 2018. No one else has that power in Asia apart from the United States. The Chinese only have one. The Indian Defense Forces, if you include reserves, are about the same as the Chinese, about 3 million, including reserves. And the Indians have been clearly indicating they're uncomfortable with the Chinese move towards the Indian Ocean. They've also been building anti-submarine ships, which are clearly primarily looking at China. They were delighted at the recent election results in Sri Lanka, where the new president, Sirisena, has indicated he will not be as favorable to the Chinese influx as his predecessor. They're, of course, delighted that the US has basically won Burma back from the Chinese, because there were all sorts of stories. I mean, the Chinese were still are building pipelines through Burma, which is fine, but there are suggestions that there was also military intentions there and deep port facilities. So you can see that India is kind of pushing back. It's starting from a smaller base. But India, I think, is indicating, and Modi has very clearly indicated that he wants to cooperate much more closely with the United States than in the past. Now, who knows what will happen? India is a democracy of an extremely colorful variety. Its bureaucracy is legendary, and many previous prime ministerial initiatives have foundered on this extraordinary system that they got from the British and made even more impenetrable. But I think that the intention is India's coming out, and it will be interesting to see how that develops, and also how they play the India-China card, because in the end of the day, India doesn't need to have a conflict with China, but it needs to have some kind of a clear basis on which their relationship will progress.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So we're here at UCLA. I think it's fair to say one of the things that we do pretty well in the US is run universities. I taught in Melbourne Uni last spring. I was very impressed. I think Australia does a fantastic job as well. So the question I have for the panel is this and of course we bring students from everywhere, and I saw this in Australia. I know we do this very well here at UCLA and in the US. We bring students from throughout, particularly Asia, but really everywhere. So is this an important tool of soft power for both countries in the region? And how can we, I don't want to say use this tool, a tool is maybe the wrong word. Is it a force for good for us? And can we do it better? Can we do a better job? In other words, can our universities and our educational ties, social ties that grow out of that be a force for change for the better? And that's really to any of you.
Well, the short answer is absolutely. A couple things. I want to pick up on Terry's point about rule of law. One of I'd say the biggest challenge for the region is establishing a common vocabulary about what the rule of law means. If you think about the defense structures, it's really trying to create a space in which you have militaries trying to resolve things through the rule of law as opposed through force. So the South China Sea is a perfect example of that. There are lots of ways that you could resolve the competing disputes in the South China Sea, and I'll tie this back to education in a moment. But you could do it through a series of agreements among the parties. You could submit it to an arbitrator. You could just agree that even if you can't draw the lines, you'll have some joint agreement about exploration and development. You can do lots of things within existing legal structures that would resolve disputes there. The one thing that doesn't work is having your ships running up into other ships and trying to shove them out of the way. History shows that that has never been a successful way of resolving disputes, and it leads to negative consequences. So what we're trying to do is develop a mentality, a culture, that takes advantage of all the learning we've done about the value of rule of law. Same thing when it comes to our economic relationships, you know, trying to set some basic rules about intellectual property protection and, you know, some of the sticking points that we've had in terms of how currency is set. And then when you talk about diplomatically, again, you want to have existing structures in place. Now, how do you bridge a system where one country's idea of rule of law is very much like a contract rule of law, you know, which is I'll just negotiate with based on my leverage over every other weaker country and get what I want, and every contract is separate from another contract. I just get the best deal I can one at a time. Or what I think is more the Western U.S. View, which is much more statutory law. Let's set a playing field that works for everyone, and then we all play within that one set of rules. That's kind of the cultural difference. That's going to take a generation to resolve this. And I think having students from our schools getting to know each other, getting to experience the two, getting a broader sense of history, are better appreciating, you know, China's perspective, but they're getting a better sense of our commitment to free speech, freedom of religion, free trade, freedom of movement, and how those all create a more sustainable and more innovative and, frankly, more, from our view, effective society. That exchange will find some common grounds and will get us to a rule of law that we all can live with. It may not look exactly like the one that we would like, but that's the nature of compromise. It will be one that we can all live with. And I think that's going to come from institutions, from educators, and from this cross-pollination of ideas among students and thinkers.
You do it badly, and that's something you've got to deal with. You don't interact as effectively as you could. You've got the best higher education system in the world. There is no question about that. You have the most fabulous diversity, the best research institutes, the most potent brand names, give or take one or two English universities and the odd French one. You've got absolutely everything going for you, and you just muck around. And California is fairly exempt from this. You do better from the California universities into Asia, but elsewhere, no. You just managed to pass us in the number of Chinese students you're educating 2 years ago. That happened on my watch. You just went past us. Pardon? Here you have the most powerful higher education system in the world, from a population 15 times the size of Australia, and you went past us 2 years ago, and you're not far past. There is a major challenge for the capacity of the United States to use this utterly critical element of American soft power. It's worked well for us in each of the Southeast Asian countries where we want to build close relationships for security purposes and otherwise. We have over 100,000 Australian graduates in all of them, and most of them are in their foreign affairs departments. And once time, I don't think this applies now, but half the Malaysian government was educated in Australia. That's been enormously important to us. The US doesn't think like that. The US thinks anarchically. It tends to, each campus thinks of its own, and there's sort of very rarely a coherent nationwide US strategy. That, I suppose, is part of your strength, but it's also, on odd occasions, means that you don't take full advantage of what your capacities are. The University of California education system is beyond brilliant, but utterly diplomatically underutilised.
Interesting. Terry?
Yeah, I think Kim's absolutely right. There's about 800,000 foreign students in the United States, 100,000 of them here in California, so we're doing pretty well here. And as you probably know, the top three are the Chinese, 230,000, the Indians, 130, and then the South Koreans. So Asia is clearly coming here. We could do a lot more. You know, you just have to think of the effects of these students who come here. And we don't, once they get here, we don't have to do a lot. The United States sells itself. If you come from a country like China, where Google is banned, where they're now cracking down on VPN so you can't even get outside of the Great Firewall, and you come to the United States, we don't have to sell you the US. It's right here. You just click on your computer and you can see how free you are. And the effects of the multiplier of those 230,000 students, some of whom will stay, of course, some will go back, who now think, the United States is actually not such a bad place. And, you could live there. It's pretty cool. That's huge in terms of soft power, as Kim mentioned. And the more we can do to foster that, the better. I also point out that for the 230,000 Chinese students in the United States, there are 14,000 Americans who study in China, which is pretty small. And a lot of those, frankly, when you take those numbers apart, they're not even there for a 4-year course. They're there for, maybe 2 months or something to kind of get to know the country. So it should be a two-way ship, and I think it behoves our universities and their administrations to make it more, not only easier, but I think perhaps even try and make it more of a requirement that American students to study overseas, because our ignorance of the outside world is colossal. I face that every day in my job to try and help Americans understand the outside world. So I think it should be a two-way flow too.
Absolutely. Great. That was terrific. So.